What do you think a school of fish, a group of people, and a bunch of electric cells have in common? They are pretty dissimilar at first glance, right? Each system expresses different behaviors and seems to have different objectives. Fish organize in groups trying to find safety and end up creating these hypnotic amorphous shapes which confuse predators, while people, given enough numbers, form societies where the individuals engage in complex traditions and rituals. And neurons, forming in dense networks, create one of the most complex systems that we know of. For now, the only one that has reached the consciousness of itself. Yet these systems have a few things in common that ultimately might be fundamental to the behaviors they display. Notice that each of these is composed of smaller parts, simple and similar to the rest of the parts. Think of the brain, which happens to be the most contrasting example, being the most complex yet formed by the simple neuron. Unlike humans, who tend to think of themselves as rather unique, neurons, if cognitive, would realize that they are almost identical to the others. But neurons cannot think. Only a group of billions of them, by forming intricate patterns and pathways, can think. It is the interaction of these simple parts that give rise to the behaviors that no individual can display, a property only manifested in the aggregation, at the group level. This is what we call emergence. We can ask ourselves, when is that emergence and how does that look like? In this video, we will explore emergence by studying a very simple system in which small variations lead to surprising patterns, from periodic to chaotic, and that in the middle we find the emergence of complex behaviors. Perhaps as a disclaimer, I should mention that in general the topic of emergence still has many open questions, and this video is by no means an attempt to explain all the inner workings of emergence. Many mysteries remain, and I hope you remain intrigued by the end of this video, eager to look for the rest of the answer to feed our curious brains. Out of the way, let's get it on. Our model system is called the cellular automaton. We can imagine the most basic one by grouping a bunch of blinking tile friends. One of these tiles is officially called a cell. Each cell can be described by two things. First, it has a state, either on or off, active or inactive, alive or dead. And second, a position, which for simplicity we take as position in a one-dimensional line. A group of cells is an automaton. This one cell is named Lucy. Position is important because then Lucy has neighbors. What will happen is that Lucy will decide what state it will be next, looking at its current state and also looking at the state of its neighbors. You can think that Lucy follows a particular rule given the state of the neighborhood. Let's suppose that Lucy only looks at its two closest neighbors to make a decision. We can also say that Lucy will have a neighborhood of radius 1, since it only looks at one neighbor to the left and its right. How many possibilities are there for decisions? I mean, how many possible configurations of neighborhood cells, each being on or off, are there in a single neighborhood? Let's count them. For the cell to Lucy's left, we have two possible states. Lucy will have also two possible states, and the cell to the right also has two possible states. In total, we have 8 possible neighborhood configurations that are shown here. Now, we can describe the rule that Lucy follows to do next like this. For each of the possible configurations, Lucy can set the next state as either on or off. Here, you can see that for every configuration the next step is just off. And here you can see another rule that's a little bit more nuanced. Now that we got a hand of how Lucy behaves, let's build a whole community. To do this, we just arrange a bunch of cells side by side. Keep in mind the rule. Each of these cells in this one-dimensional space will update its status based on the state of its neighbors. Everybody follows the same rule. For the initial states, we can randomly assign them to either on or off. Or we can just light up a single one in the center as on and the rest as off. Even when all of these follow the same rule, since the neighborhoods all differ, multiple patterns start to emerge. Looking at these single lines of automata is not so enlightening, right? Let's start over. We could plot the systems changing through time using another dimension, the sphere axis y. By plotting each step side by side across time, we have an easier time seeing the patterns that arise. Looks better? Remember that we can change the rule, and each rule shows a different pattern. Check this one. When you look at this automata, you start noticing that they are kind of dividing classes according to the behavior. On one hand, you have the automata that follow rather uninteresting rules, since they quickly move to steady, homogeneous states. As a trivial example, take the rule where possible neighbor configurations send the next state to active. In this case, from step 2, you'll have an all-active grid. Moving a bit in complexity, you have the rules that generate periodic patterns, such as this one. As the name indicates, in these rules eventually the pattern repeats. If the pattern repeats after 2 time steps, we say that it has a period of 2. In general, a rule that repeats the pattern after a number of x steps has a period of x. Then, there is an opposite to this periodicity, is an example of that. This is a famous rule that exhibits chaotic behavior. It's called Rule 30. Though there is a way to prove why this is a chaotic system, what it implies visually is that there is no discernible pattern as the rule progresses. There is no predictable repetition of the patterns, and by extension, no periodicity. You can also say that the period is infinite. Rule 30 is pretty cool by itself, but to see emergence, we must look at what happens between simple periodicity. For this kind of automata of neighborhood size 3, we can imagine a spectrum with periodicity on one end and chaos at the other. All rules that describe elementary automatas fall here, and somewhere in that spectrum lies the interesting in-between. For us, these are rules that do not exhibit obvious periodicity, simple behaviors, yet don't fall into chaotic behavior either. There is a sense of additional order and structure that is maintained by the rule. The rule we're seeing now is called 110 and exhibits such behavior. You might think that this looks like a bunch of stairs of varying sizes, which will be right. But notice also that there seems to be a sort of structure, a background made up of the smaller stairs, and an emergent structure made by stairs of different sizes. This structure winds along the x-axis while it travels through time. In Rule 110, some patterns repeat and others interact. In fact, it is proven that this rule can be used to simulate a computer. It's a complete Turing machine, though the way it works is complicated and a single program might take ages to run. You will not be programming any algorithm in one of these soon. A key component in the functioning of the automaton as a Turing machine is that the patterns that emerge interact in particular unpredictable ways, and this can be interpreted as computations. This is a key notion that we will look into while exploring what emergence is. Many people have explored these kinds of automatas. For example, a team led by Melanie Mitchell studied automatas that could fulfill specific tasks, essentially automatas that perform computations to achieve particular final states based on its initial states. We're going to talk about one of the most interesting examples they found. Remember that we defined this automaton as having a radius of 1? Let's expand that a bit and think of the automata with a radius equals 3. This means that to decide its next step, the cell will look at the state of its 3 neighbors to the right and 3 neighbors to the left. Here, the number of possibilities for neighborhood states increases exponentially. Since each neighbor could have 2 states, in total we have 2 to the 7, 128 possible configurations of different neighborhoods. This means that a single rule will need to specify 2 to the 128 configurations, and that's a big number. In the end, we have a much bigger space of possibilities, even though the underlying working is still the same. Check your neighbors and decide what we're going to give a task to this kind of automata. Say we start with an automata where certain percentage of the cells are active, randomly placed. Then, all cells must come to an agreement on whether the majority of cells are either on or off. For example, let's have our automata have 51 cells, 30 of them active. The rule kicks in, something happens in the middle, and by the end, all of the 51 cells become on or active. If we started with 40 inactive cells, after whatever happens in the middle, also called a transient period, the idea is that all cells become off or inactive. Should a rule that performs this task more or less do? Let's look at a very naive attempt at a solution. Our naive rule goes like this. Step 1. Check the neighbors, and if the majority are off, then turn off. Else, if the majority is on, turn on. Step 2. That's all, there is no additional steps. Pretty simple, right? But does it work? Let's run some examples. We can call this one the majority rule, and we see that while this rule is able to detect local high density regions, that is, regions with more predominant active or predominant inactive, at the end it fails at the boundaries where local active and inactive densities are the same. The majority rule, however, gives us greater insight into what a successful rule should do. It seems that to resolve what happens at the boundaries of equal density off and on, a better rule should do two additional things. First, it should somehow combine the density information with boundaries, and second, it should have some way of communicating or to transport this information horizontally across different regions of this one-dimensional grid of cells. Since it is almost impossible to check all the different rules one by one, like what could be done with the automata of radius 1, scientists had to use other methods to discover good rules that could perform this task. In the paper by Mitchell and team, they used genetic algorithms, which allowed them to more effectively explore the space of possible rules. I will not delve into the particular details of how it was done, but I will leave the reference in the description below, so you can check how it worked. This is pretty cool stuff. What we will do, however, is talk about one of the interesting rules they found that works quite well, and we'll see how is that it works that way. Let's run this rule. Notice how the triangular patterns start to form. Here is the first key aspect of the solution. The patterns sweep from side to side of the grid, transporting the density information. This seems to indicate that our expectation of information moving across the lattice is happening. Then, you see that these triangles and geometric regions start sort of interacting. Let's stop one particular scenario. When they meet, or better, when regions meet, other patterns start to emerge. This in turn points to the other expectation we had about a good rule, and that is that it should be able to combine information of different density regions. Now, much of this geometry information is in reality superfluous. All of the action of interaction or merging of information could be characterized by what happens at the boundaries between regions. So what we'll do is to remove these regularities in the shapes, the all-on regions, all-off regions, and the checkerboard repetitive patterns in the automata evolution. See how the boundary is now transformed to particular patterns of lines that travel to the lattice, and further, notice how these lines sort of collide and form other kinds of lines. The way a kind of line A interacts with other of kind B always results in a new line or region of the same kind C. This means that the lines interact in predictable patterns. There is one final modification to our visualization that we can do to make it more clear. Instead of plotting all the automata steps at the same time, let's plot each step one by one, moving through time, and remove other steps. Each type of line is actually the trace of a small pattern that moves through time, a piece of something. And visualized like this, you can see why it makes sense to call this rule the particle rule. It is clear now that the particles travel, interact, and generate other particles. One can label each type of pattern or particle individually, because in fact they follow a set of rules of interaction, similar to what one sees in particle physics. Let's step back and see why this behavior of the automata with this particular rule is so fascinating. We have a system of individual cells, each following a static rule. At least at the cell level, there is no notion of particles. For a single cell or even a single neighborhood, there is not even a notion of information traveling. They just know their rule. This points to a loosely definition of emergence where two things happen. First is that the system shows behavior that its parts do not have. And second is that this behavior arises from the interaction of its components. This means that for us to truly see this notion of particles, we must look not at the individual cells, neither at the individual root configurations, but rather at the patterns that evolve over time when a whole group of these cells interact. For me, this is a clear example of emergence, where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. You'll start to see this emergence in systems everywhere, from the simple ants creating complex roadways that they use to move not only food but information, to the behaviors that underlie societal interactions. There is even one key characteristic that makes ants and humans give rise to even more complex and intricate emergent behaviors. Remember that the cells in the automata always follow the static rule. But we, as well as ants, can adapt individually to what is going on in our environment. The rules can change for each individual, and the possibilities explode. Nonetheless, it's remarkable how we can start understanding how simple components create emergence by looking at little blinking tiles.